Hi, my name is Lenia Slierendrecht and I work as program maker for Studium Generale of Erasmus University. Focus on what you can control, not on the things you cannot change. The lessons of the ancient Stoic philosophers have surged in popularity in the last decade. From famous athletes to successful CEOs, many swear by the writings of Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. But why? How is it that such an old philosophy resonates in modern times? And how can one become a Stoic themselves? Dr. Michiel Buis received his PhD from Erasmus School of Philosophy on the contemporary application of ancient Stoicism. He now works as a researcher at Breda University of Applied Sciences, focusing on the ethical dimensions of sustainability, and is committed to building bridges between philosophical practice and theory. This podcast is a registration of an event at Erasmus University. Do you want to join our programs live? Check out our website or socials for the full calendar. Enjoy the lecture.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all for being here, because I know that Feyenoord also plays a match tonight, so I almost wasn't here myself, but I thought, it might be handy that I am here, so thank you for that. And actually we're going to talk about a philosophy that has a lot in common with the football club Feyenoord. Right, so you know that they're about deeds, not words, and that's almost literally that one of the famous Stoic philosophers, Seneca, also wrote down. Our philosophy, Stoic philosophy, is about deeds, not about words. All right, so before I am going to start, I actually want to ask you something, and luckily I can see the audience here. Are there people here who identify as a Stoic, or who say like, okay, I'm trying to be Stoic? Don't be afraid. Yeah, quite a lot actually. I see about 15 hands there. Are there people who came in here and said, Stoicism, what is that? Yeah? Also, don't be afraid. Okay. Very good. So that just so I know what kind of audience we have here. What I'm going to talk about today is Stoicism is popular nowadays again. If you go to the philosophy department of a bookstore, you will see Stoicism a lot in there. Sometimes almost exclusively Stoicism. That's how popular it is nowadays. And I want to talk about how come, but also a question that a lot of people ask me is, but is that actually Stoicism? You know, it's an old philosophy dating back to 300 BCE, so it's 2,300 years old. Are they really doing Stoicism there, or is it just something else? So I hope that this question interests you, because otherwise you're stuck here for quite a bit, actually. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So this is hopefully what we're going to be doing. So first of all, I will introduce you to Stoicism, especially for those people who have never heard of Stoicism. What is it actually? Then we're going to compare the old Stoicism, the Roman Stoicism especially, with the modern day Stoic books that you find in the bookstores. And when we have done that comparison, there will be differences, just as a spoiler already. Then I want to talk about, okay, now that we know the differences and that maybe modern day Stoicism isn't quite the same as ancient Stoicism, is that bad or not? Well, we will see. But if you want to be a Stoic, how could you do that in a way that is faithful to the old philosophy? That is part 3, how to be a Stoic, living in harmony with nature. That's an important topic. And no, we're not going to be talking about climate change here. Lastly, I hope that we can maybe have a look at some Stoic exercises. Like I said, Stoicism is about action. It's not about talking all of the time, and that's why it's a bit contradictory that I'm standing here, because I am going to talk about it all of the time, but actually it's a philosophy about doing things. And so there are a lot of exercises for Stoics to be working on. And I've been told that probably you might have some questions at the end, or some comments, or some disagreements with me. That's all very welcome. We can talk about that later. Also, by the way, if I'm talking about something here and you really feel the urge to say something, please do. Okay, philosophy or Stoic philosophy is also a philosophy of dialogue, of talking with each other. And so if something doesn't make sense, or if I'm going too fast, if it doesn't make sense, then probably you're not the only one thinking that, so please do come forward with that. Okay, so first, an introduction to Stoicism. Okay, so here you have some example of a bookstore and what there is to see on Stoicism. There's a lot of Stoicism in here, actually. So you can see in here, The Obstacle is the Way is a very famous modern Stoic book. We will talk about it later. But you can see it everywhere. But how come? Why is it there? That was actually the question that I had back in 2012, I think, when there were 1 or 2 books in there about Stoicism. And that was when I did my master's on philosophy, and I said, well, that's a good master's thesis, to compare those 2 or 3 books on Stoicism, who say, like, okay, Stoicism is actually really relevant for the modern times, to compare that with the ancient philosophy. Okay, so back then, maybe some of you know the names. It was Jules Evans who wrote a book back then, Bill Irvine. Those were the first who were talking about Stoicism. So in 2012, 2013, that was when the first books, recent books on Stoicism, and especially on the modern day application of Stoicism, were there. Okay, so I did that, and then I went off to teach philosophy at a high school. And during that time, more and more Stoic books came out. So when we were in like 2017, it was all over the place, really. It was like it is still nowadays. Almost everything in the philosophy department was Stoicism. So I reached out to my professor and I said, like, shouldn't I do another research on that? And he agreed, luckily. And so I finished that about a year ago and defended that in the beginning of this year. Just researching, okay, this modern day Stoicism, what is that about? Okay, before we do that, I want to talk about a few points that we do need to consider when we compare modern day Stoicism with ancient Stoicism. The first one is, and we will keep coming back to those points as well. The first one is the cultural historical context. What does that mean? We are embedded in a culture, in a history, in our modern day society, just as the ancient Stoics were as well. Right? Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, I will say the names, maybe some of you know them, Epictetus, they all wrote in Rome in the first centuries of our common age. And they were embedded in a society. And some of those things that they were embedded in, we just don't recognize anymore, or we don't understand anymore. So for them, it was completely normal to think that time went in cycles, for example. Well, we see it as linear now. Okay, so when we read something and they are talking about time, we naturally do it with the things that we think about nowadays. And so it takes some reconstruction sometimes to understand what they're really saying. And as we will see in modern day Stoicism, this doesn't always go right. Secondly, what we need to think about is that the ancient Stoics, that their corpus, that their books, that the works that we have is very limited. And I mean very, very, very limited. So the 3 writers I talked about just now, they are basically the only 3 writers that we have works from. 2 of them just 1 work. Seneca, we have quite a lot actually from him. But they were writing when Stoicism was already 300 years old. 300 years of development in Stoicism, 300 years of theory they were leaning on, 300 years of assumptions that they had in their work that we don't know, and where we have no work whatsoever from. Okay, so everything before that is lost except for fragments where other authors maybe quoted something that an older Stoic said. Okay, so we have to do a lot of interpretation actually. we often just don't know exactly what they meant with certain things that they were talking about, because for them it was like, yeah, of course, we know that. Chrysippus, one of the earlier Stoics, he talked a lot about this. He wrote several books about this, so everybody knows. I don't need to explain, but yeah, for us, they actually do, because we don't have those works anymore. Thirdly, what we need to think about is, I have analyzed modern-day Stoicism, like I said, like 2015, 2016, it became popular. It's just a philosophy of now 10 years old. And I was comparing it with a philosophy that lasted for 500 years, that had the time to develop. Right? Maybe the first Stoics, they were not quite as sophisticated as it was later, maybe. Right? And with that, I'm giving some hints on how I see modern Stoicism, right? It doesn't have that depth yet of ancient Stoicism. Okay? But we need to know that, yeah, it's just most of what I was analyzing was just in 5 years that it came to the rise again. So, we need to bear with them a little bit. Lastly, each philosophy has some growing insights. If we think about when Stoicism ended, because it pretty much ended after Marcus Aurelius. I mean, there were some Stoic philosophers, but Christianity became really important after that. Stoicism was like a mix between religion and philosophy, you could say. But Christianity became way too important. So Stoicism pretty much died out. Christianity also took a lot of insights from Stoicism and incorporated it into them. But yeah, now we're talking about it again 2,000 years later, 1,800 years later. And if we look at Christianity, for example, it has often adapted to newer times. It has nuanced their viewing points. It has grown with the centuries. But Stoicism wasn't able to do that. So when you are a modern-day Stoic, and you're going to look at Seneca again from 2,000 years ago and interpret that, yeah, there will be a big gap between societies. It didn't have the time to gradually evolve. So there are some strange things happening there. It didn't evolve as naturally as Christianity, for example, did. So those are some things we need to think about. It's not that easy, even though some modern-day Stoics say, like, yeah, Stoicism, you can implement it in our daily lives from second one. Well, that's not what is actually the case. Okay, a bit more in depth to modern-day Stoicism. So when I was doing this research, I noticed, like, okay, you can pretty much group those modern-day Stoic books. Maybe you recognize some of them. So you see here, top right, The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. I already talked about it. Then you have Stand Firm from Sven Brinkman. Then you have How to be a Stoic by Massimo Pigliucci. Here you have Donald Robertson with How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. A Little Book of Stoicism, Jonas Salzgeber. And the Dutch ice skater Mark Tuitert, he wrote The Stoic Mindset. Okay, so those are some of the really popular modern-day Stoic books. And like I said, there are some categories in that. So let me explain, because it might help you if you read a modern-day Stoic book, like, okay, where can I place this actually? Okay, so the first one is advice philosophy. And what those modern-day Stoics usually do is they take a few quotes from ancient Stoicism, and they build a book around those quotes. And usually they're very practical, immediately applicable, like the one, like, okay, think for yourself, what is in my power and what is not. And, well, they write something about it, like, okay, you don't lose energy if you keep thinking about things that you can't control anyway. And then they go to some others. I know Mark Tuitert has one who says, like, win by not thinking about winning. Because if you don't think about it, you will spend your energy better. It's those kinds of books. So usually what happens is that it starts with, well, just like this, 10 principles of Stoicism. So they take 10 quotes that they like, and then say, this is Stoicism, you can work with it, it's very practical, usually you get some exercises you can do, and that's it. Okay? Of course, this is useful if you don't know Stoicism. This is really useful if you have some pointers towards, but yeah, as you can imagine, it's not the most philosophical kind of books. It's usually people who don't like philosophy who say like, yeah, that's when I like philosophy actually. Okay, the second one is therapy philosophy, therapy Stoicism. By the way, the advice philosophy would also count for Ryan Holiday, I would say, for those who read that, and also for Jonas Salzgeber. Then we go to therapy philosophy, and that is Donald Robertson. He is a psychiatrist, actually. And we have some in the Netherlands as well. Maybe some of you know Mirjam van Rijen. She's also writes about Stoicism. She's also in the therapy corner. And what does that mean? They are trying to, if you are worried about your thoughts, if you somehow don't manage to do things the way you want to do, you can use Stoicism to think sanely again. Okay, so this is usually if you are in trouble or if things don't go the way you want to, then Stoicism can help you. And then it's often about, okay, research your own thinking. And again, it's almost always it goes back to what is in your control and what is not. And then they're like, okay, are your thoughts effective about what you're thinking about now? You're worrying a lot. But can you actually do something about it? No, you can't do something about it. Then change your thinking. Right? So it's always about changing your thinking. Okay, so then it becomes a kind of therapy. There are actually really famous therapies who say that they are influenced by Stoicism. Right? So the cognitive therapy is influenced by Stoicism, as well as behavioral therapies. So some of the biggest therapies around now used by psychiatrists, the founders of them said, okay, we are actually influenced by Stoics. Right? And so one of the famous quotes that is used here is, it's not the things that happen to us that upset us, but the way we think about those things that upset us. Right? Think about that. I think that there is a huge truth in that. Things just happen, but the way we think about it, that is what upsets us, because we think about it probably in a wrong way, would the Stoics say. Third one is life philosophy, and that would be Massimo Pigliucci, and they are trying to get, it's also kind of advice philosophy, but it's more about apply to every part of your life, not just advices that you can use sometimes, but try to implement it. Right? And so then it comes a bit closer to ancient Stoicism, because that is a life philosophy for sure. It's a way of living. And lastly, there's an odd one out. It's what I would call protest Stoicism, and that's what Sven Brinkman is. I would categorize him under that. We also have a Dutch writer. She's a really interesting one. She's called Riemke Wiersma, and she actually wrote before all of the others who wrote about Stoicism in 2012. I actually missed her back then. And she's a children's book writer, and she also wrote a book about Stoicism. And she uses it as a way to protest against our society, basically, about the way we do things, because Stoics actually do things differently. She argues that Stoicism is a very left-winged philosophy, but often, maybe some of you have heard it, that Stoicism is also used in very conservative, right-wing areas. So I think what that already says, and so we will talk about it more, is that it's actually not that political. Back in the days when Seneca was living, he was an advisor for the emperor back then, for Emperor Nero. But the opposition was also called the Stoic opposition. So they were on both sides. And I think that can be applied to nowadays as well. It's not a political philosophy. We'll see that. All right, so those are the types of modern Stoic books that you can encounter. And of course, it's not that when one book is an advice book that they can't have any therapy in there or something. It's more like ideal types, right? Then to classical Stoicism. So it was founded in 300 BCE by a philosopher called Zeno. First it was called Zenoism, but because he was always teaching at the painted porch, which is a stoa poikile in Greek, it was called Stoicism later. That's something that often happens, like the Academy of Plato, and for Aristotle as well. It's always named after where they were teaching. Okay, so there were 3 periods, and we only know something about the late Stoa. There was the Roman Stoa. So the early Stoa was in Greece. Then you had the middle Stoic philosophy who changed their philosophy a bit. We know a bit about it, but for now it's not that relevant. They were residing in Rhodos, so somewhere else. The first one were in Athens, then it went to Rhodos, and then it went to Rome. Right? And that is the area or the time period where all of the modern Stoics, they always refer to the late Stoa. And the reason is very simple, because those are the works that we have, right? The other ones, yeah, you can try to reconstruct, but it's really easy to read Seneca because his books just survived. And they are translated everywhere. All of the works from Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius are translated in Dutch as well. It's widely available. So that is why they're going towards them. There's also a different reason why late Stoicism is very popular, because the ethics became more and more important. So the early Stoics, they were talking about physics, for example. So about, okay, how did our world begin? How does it work? Right? Natural science, they were talking a lot about that. And about logic. Like, okay, when is an argumentation valid? And like really abstract, like A and A plus B equals C and stuff like that. They were doing that as well. Like this old logic type of things. Later on, the Stoics said more and more like, okay, yeah, it's nice to know how the world actually works, but it's actually more important to know how to live a good life. So it is important to study nature. We already saw living in harmony with nature. It is important to study nature, but especially because through studying nature you can see how you can live a good life. Okay, so the main goals is living a well-reasoned, virtuous life in accordance with nature. And again, we will talk about it later, what that exactly means. And 2, achieving tranquility, Greek ataraxia, through mastery of passions and alignment with reasons. Yeah, I haven't mentioned passions yet. I did that on purpose because when you talk about Stoicism, everyone thinks like, okay, you can't have any emotions, you need to suppress them, stuff like that. Yeah, it's a bit more nuanced like that, but yeah, you are right if you think that they are not that happy with if you live completely by your passions. They say like reason needs to have an important role. Okay, so this as a general introduction to Stoicism. Let's then go to the comparison. Okay, so the 3 domains that I already mentioned, physics, ethics, and logics in classical Stoicism. What the late Stoics did, so the Roman Stoics that we are talking about, they said like, okay, physics, logics is actually not that important. We translate it into what I call areas of attention. So we need to pay attention to the things that we learn from physics, right? So that's what I said. Natural study is important, but as long as it leads to living a better life. And actually studying nature, the most important thing that we learn is, again, that there are things that are in our control and that are not in our control. And so it means that we need to think about what we desire. Do we desire things that are in our control, or do we desire things that are not in our control? And the Stoics, they were pretty rigorous about what we can and cannot control. Because the only thing that we really can control is our own mind, our own thoughts, our own strivings. Everything else is out of our control. Okay, so I may have a good intention, but it can always be frustrated by something, and we don't have that in our control. So the only thing that we should desire is to be a good person. If you desire that, then nothing can stop you from living a happy life, because you get all that you desire, because everyone can be a good person. Okay, so if you strive for wealth, yeah, that's not in your control. You can do everything you want, you can do for it. You can spend your whole life trying to get rich, but you still might fail. And even if you manage to do it, you might get robbed. Or you might marry the wrong person who spends all of your money. Right? So wealth is not in your power. If you strive for that, then probably at some point in your life you're bound to be unhappy. Unless you're lucky, but yeah, living your life based on being lucky, I mean, when you can also live your life on a well-reasoned manner, that you're always happy, that's not the way to go. Right? And the same goes for a number of things that they mention. If you strive for status, yeah, that's not in your control. You can do everything to be a reputable person, but the way others think about you is not in your control. So don't strive for that. What you can strive for is being a good person. Fame, same thing. Right? You get the idea, right? It's only in your own mind that you can be happy. So maybe you've heard of things like, you know, there is a book, and there is actually a book about that from the 70s by James Stockdale, who was being held in Vietnam for 7 years in a prison there. And he said, because of Stoicism, I survived, and actually could be happy there. Okay, and this is the most, I mean, I don't know how he did that, and I don't know if it's actually true, what he wrote afterwards. But he said, you know what? Being tortured, I mean, that was not in my control. What was in my control was what I was thinking. The ancient Stoics, they actually say about that, they say like, okay, you know, someone can control everything of you, but they can't take the victory from you, because the victory is when they break you inside. If you don't do that, then you are actually the true victor, right? So maybe you see now also, it's also used a lot in the army, for example, Stoicism, because of this way of thinking. Okay, but that's an extreme example. I'm not going to ask you to be happy while you're being tortured, but you can implement it, of course, in small things of your life, where you get really angry about something, then take a step back and think like, okay, is it justified that I'm angry about this? Was this unfair? What can I do about it? Right? What kind of person do I want to be? Do I want to be this angry person or not? Yeah? So this is the first one, the area of attention. You see, it's all about the self. That changes when we talk about ethics, and they are changing that again to, okay, what can I do in my life? And they are talking about intention there. Okay, so we now see like, okay, what is in your power and what is not? Well, what is not in your power, or what is in your power, is your own thoughts, but what are actually the right thoughts to have? What is the right intention to have? And then they're saying, okay, if you think about it, we're all here together, so we need to think about how can I be a good part of this universe? Okay? So they say everything happens for a reason. Well, I don't know if that is, but that is something that the Stoics said. Nothing happens just because it happens. And so if that is true, then it is reasonable what is happening. Everything is reasonable what happens. And that is why we need to take part in that reason. So we need to be reasonable ourselves. Okay, so now we get a bit to why passions are bad, because you are going against the order of nature. Okay, so even if we totally don't understand ourselves why it is happening for a reason. Why? Because everything needs to grow, everything needs to perish. That is how nature works, because things perish so that other things can grow. And so it is part of these laws of nature that are happening, that are in the end working towards something good. And the last one is logics. And logics, it is also the end of what you could say the Stoic education. Okay, so you start by managing your desires. That's the starting point. Then you're going to expand a bit and say like, okay, I want to be a good person for everyone, yes?
In the one before, you mentioned harmony and I can see collaboration.
Yeah.
Hierarchy, you didn't say anything about.
Yeah, all right, okay, yeah, very good, yeah. So you're saying, I talked about harmony and collaboration, but not about hierarchy. Yes, so they say we are born to work together and everyone has their place in it. And so that is indeed important to mention, because that is something really of that time, right? So Roman society was very much focused on the army. Everyone had their place. And so they said, don't try to be someone you are not, but you have your own role in this world. Try to be the best at that role. Yeah, so that might be something that might not appeal that much because, yeah, it might also be that you have to be the best slave in the world. Don't try that you have to become something else. Okay? Maybe it is good to say a bit about that. It's not that they say that slavery is good. They say, yes, slavery is bad. Seneca actually says that. But he says, while it is the case right now, you can become really unlucky or unhappy that you are a slave, or you can say, I want to change this, but from now, I'm not going to let this affect me. Even though, yes, harmony, everyone is valuable, everyone is part of this reasonable world, so everyone is equal, but don't let it affect you now. So they say you can be a revolutionary, let's put it like that, but don't let it affect you too much. Accept what is there, and then try to change it. Okay. Do you want to, saw a hand, no? Okay. Lastly then, the logics. So the question there is, what do I agree to? It's about judgment. When can you make a judgment? And it's strange that we're talking about judgment at the very end of Stoic education. So we're talking about desires first. You're going to try to have the right desires. Then you're going to try to think in benevolence, let's put it like that, into wanting the best for others, for everyone. And only then you can make your own judgments. Something that we would normally start with, right? So first we're going to make judgments and then we're going to go on. What they're saying is, if you start with judgments, then your judgments are actually clouded still by the wrong desires. So you can't look at something objectively because you have the wrong desires. You have emotions flowing through you who are going to decide what your judgment is. You need to do it without that. And you don't have the benevolence towards others yet when you're judging. You're not looking at it from the bigger picture, from what is good for all of us. So if you're doing judgments without that, then they're really unreliable. You can only do that later on. And it's a bit of, especially for modern Stoics, it's a bit of a conflict. Well, they don't think about those kind of things, by the way, modern Stoics. They just say, like, okay, put your own judgment on it. But if you would do this nowadays, it's a bit difficult because you need to follow a philosophy where they say, you know, don't judge yet if it's correct what we're saying. Do it first. Because if you're now saying, like, yeah, get rid of emotions, yeah, that's nonsense, then they say, like, yeah, that's because you're still full of emotions. You first need to get rid of them, and then you can think about it in a reasonable, clear manner, and then you will see, indeed, emotions are really useless to have, and they're actually going to the wrong direction. There's a lot of bad coming from that. Okay, so judgment is only there for the ones who are advanced in Stoicism, who don't have those emotions yet, who do have the right desires, who are thinking in benevolence. Not for the ordinary layman. By the way, layman, the Greek word for layman that the Stoics were using was idiotes. So I'm not saying I'm in a room full of idiots, but... Okay, modern Stoicism then. So let's go back to those attention areas. Let's see how far I am. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so we will get to that a bit later as well, but I will tell you a bit about it. So physics is the main thing that Stoics learn from nature is this dichotomy of control, what we call that. So they say if you look into nature, you will see that things happen whether you want it or not. Okay, so we need to learn something from that. If we look at nature, there's a book by Seneca, it's called The Questiones Naturales, Natural Questions, and he's doing physics there actually. And he always ends with an ethical epilogue. And he says, for example, we have the seas, the winds, that's a better example. So he was studying the winds, and he has some interesting but very outdated scientific study about the winds. Then he ends ethically and he says, like, you know, we use the winds the wrong way, because what do we do with the winds? We are building sailing boats, and we're going to distant shores, and we're taking things from there, and we make war with others when we meet different civilizations. But actually, the winds are there to carry the seeds, to carry the fruits, so that we have enough food for ourselves, and that we don't have to fight war with each other. So we need to learn from nature, and we need to correctly interpret nature, and we need to study what nature is trying to tell us. Then we can live a good life and not abuse nature in this kind of way. Okay, so that are some of the ways that they're doing. If you're interested in this, definitely read the Questiones Naturalis. It's a really underrated book. It's almost read by no one, but I think it's really a really important Stoic book. So if you want to do that, then get that one. Okay, then modern Stoicism. Modern Stoicism doesn't see philosophy as a life philosophy, but especially as a tool, right? So we see now that ancient Stoicism, it's really a way of living. It's a way that you are doing things. If you are a Stoic in every fiber of your soul. But for modern Stoics, Stoicism is usually a tool, something that you can help sometimes if you're stuck, if you want to beat the competition, if you want to become more successful at something, you can use some Stoic principles. Okay, so that's a really different way of approaching Stoicism and philosophy in general. Okay, so how do they deal with those attention areas? So when we talk about desire, they are really doing it in a commonsensical way. So when we're talking about anger, for example, they say, like, okay, anger, why would you be angry? It's not useful to be angry. Usually you're hurting yourself with that. So don't do that. But there are some times that anger is useful, okay? Usually it's not useful, right? Okay, so that's a really different way of approaching this, right? I was talking about, like, you have to become reasonable to be part of the bigger universe. They're not talking about those kind of things, modern Stoics. They say, like, anger is just not useful. Sadness is not useful. Jealousy, it's not useful. Why would you do that? Okay, so that's really commonsensical, very pragmatical. So they are taking over this idea of emotions, or passions rather, because not every emotion, but passions, that they are wrong to have, but they have a completely different reasoning behind it. Maybe it makes sense, let's say it like that. Maybe it makes sense because, you know, to say to people like, okay, become part of this greater universe, this greater reason, is difficult, but this is really easy to say, yes. Passions, yeah. Okay, so the question is, what is my definition of passions in here? Indeed, it is different than we usually think about it. So for us, emotions is something different than the pate, actually, in Greek, or Seneca in Latin calls it an affectus. It is something different. What the Stoics see as a passion is something that first comes to you. So let's say you become really sad about something. You hear something, you're starting to cry. That's not an emotion yet for the Stoics. But if you afterwards start crying and then think, yeah, this is really unfair, what happened to me, then it becomes an emotion. Okay, so the first one is like the first hiccup, you would say. And you cannot control that. The Stoics also say that. You cannot control if you feel this surge of anger coming up, or if you are starting to blush. You cannot control that. But if you afterwards confirm that with your thinking, then it becomes an emotion. Okay? So it's not quite the same as an emotion in modern day, and it might also change the way that you think about what Stoics say about emotions, because I think it's more reasonable to agree, like, okay, yeah, we have this surge of anger, but yeah, it is good to think about, like, okay, is it actually reasonable that I'm angry now? Could I actually do it better in a different way? And then I think, if I am being this practical as well, that probably 99 of 100 times you will say, like, yeah, maybe I can do it in a better way. Yes, did you want to say something? Or not? Oh, sorry. I thought you wanted to. Okay, yeah.
So would you say that ancient Stoicism had more bearing to earlier philosophical concepts and also the prevailing time period as opposed to Stoicism now?
Yeah.
Because it is below surface level. It's more use it to solve a problem.
Very good, yeah. That is, I think, when I read that, that was definitely what I saw all of the time. And the question is, of course, is that bad? Well, that is up to the reader, I guess. But yeah, it is way more pragmatical. So the question was, like, is it more pragmatical? Is it more like surface level and the other one more deep philosophical? Yeah, for sure. But like I said as well, it's only a 5 to 10-year-old philosophy, right? They have some time to make it a bit more deep. Okay, quickly through the other ones, because it's pretty much the same. Action, when we're talking about the attention area of action, right, living in harmony and stuff like that, then it's mainly about thinking about your thoughts again, like, okay, how can I become more effective at things? You really see when they are quoting ancient Stoics who are talking about harmony, that they reframe it in a way like, okay, you're doing things ineffectively now, but actually it's more effective if you think about others as well. So you see this pragmatical side again. And to ascend, I said that for ancient Stoics, ascent is like the pinnacle of their philosophy. It's when you have gone through all of the other phases. Well, that's not the case at all for modern Stoics. They always say, like, you know, this is just an advice, but think about it the way you want. If you think this is nonsense, then fine, do something else. There are more ways to get there. See the huge difference where the ancient Stoics say you can do a judgment at the end. They take the reader to be autonomous from the beginning. Right, so those are some of the differences in there. Okay, so I have noted 4 important shifts that I see in modern Stoicism and in ancient Stoicism. And those shifts are actually not that easy to pin down all of the time, and that is because of this big, long time in between. Those are some things that were happening for a long time that we see back in Stoicism. Right? Some of those things already happened in the 1700s, but you still see it back now. What do I mean with that? We are more individualistic now, the first one. Okay, so the ancient Stoics, for them it was normal to think it was, that you didn't even have to reason that you were part of a group. Right? I think some of us can even remember this when you were naturally part of a group, naturally part of a denomination, of a religious group or something like that. And that formed your identity, right? So this analysis has been made a lot of times that we're now individualistic, so I'm not going to do that. I would like to say there's a positive and a negative about that. The positive is, well, we can actually make our own lives. You can become the person you want way better than in those group-centered societies. The negative side is that you maybe lose some bonding with each other. Right? The second one is in modern Stoicism, I see what I call the economic meritocracy in there. So meritocracy is you are valued based on what you have achieved. And in our modern society, we often do that economically, by how much you earn, what kind of job you have, and stuff like that. So I see that back in modern Stoicism, that this is important, something that was way less important for the ancient Stoics. Why? Because of what we talked about, you just had your role in society. So this wasn't part of it. So you didn't always strive for being more successful. And modern Stoicism, I often say it's like trying to get ahead of your competition a bit. So they give you some tips, some good advice, so you can outsmart your opponent, so you get that job, so that you are the successful entrepreneur. Right? But actually, what they're doing with that is also that they're saying like, okay, often it's used as a way that you won't get burned out because you're not going to think about the things that are not in your power, but then you're even focusing even more on the things that are in your power, and then you're even more responsible for failing if you don't. So I would say modern Stoicism sometimes even makes you more stressed out if you're going to do that, because you're even more focused on yourself. Okay, the third one, the ancient Stoics, they were striving to be the best person that you can be. So they say what sets us apart from, what sets humans apart from other beings is our reason capacity, right? And so we need to try to be as reasonable as possible. In modern day Stoicism, you see what we all, I think, agree with in our society is that authenticity is way more important. So not that you are going to be the best version of yourself, but maybe the most true to yourself. So nowadays we would say like, you know what, in the mornings, you don't have to speak to me. I'm always annoyed then. Then we say like, yeah, that's good that you say it, be yourself. The ancient Stoic would say like, no, work on that, right? That's the difference. Lastly, very briefly, the changing role of truth, and this is actually an important one. Ancient Stoics say that you can find truth right at the very end of your education. Normal people like us, we are not actually able to grasp the truth because, you know, we have our emotions flowing over us, we have the wrong desires, we're not thinking in benevolence for others. So we cannot do that. But nowadays we say like, yeah, truth is there for everyone. Truth is not dependent on the person that is saying it. Okay, so you might see this like if you have a climate change discussion with someone who is really in their emotions. An ancient Stoic would say like, yeah, that's a good example of why it doesn't work that everyone has a claim to the truth. Because you first need to become a good person to use the facts in a good way. For us nowadays, that's not the case anymore. You might want to think about that, what this means for your study, for example, the way where you're working in. What would change if you would say like, okay, you actually need to be a good person who's, you know, has the right desires, who's thinking in benevolence for all. What would that change? I think that quite a lot could change. Okay, I see that we're almost at the end already. Okay, I think we've talked about this, so it's way more pragmatical. I do want to talk a little bit about what doesn't matter. Is it okay if I go 5 minutes for that? What does it actually matter? Okay, so what? It's more pragmatical. Okay, so first of all, my research wasn't there to say like, okay, ancient Stoicism or modern Stoicism is better. They're there for different purposes, for different people. Both of them can be useful. But it can be dangerous sometimes if we take it too much at surface value without studying it good enough. And the risk of that we can see in two branches of Stoicism. Maybe you've heard of this, Broicism and Stoicism with a dollar sign. This is especially, the last one is especially popular in the Silicon Valley, for example. And what does it mean? Broicism is, well, if you know Andrew Tate, then probably you know some of the things that Broicism is saying. So it's very traditional, conservative type of Stoicism. Stoicism with a dollar sign is like, okay, how can we make as much money as possible, and we can use some Stoic principles for that. And there are some examples in The Obstacle is the Way that I think show where the danger lies in there, and what you should try to avoid, I think, if you are a Stoic. So in The Obstacle is the Way, the author writes about George Clooney. He takes all kinds of examples, of modern day examples, of people who are very Stoic. So George Clooney is one of them. Why? Because he started off as an actor and he always tried to please the ones he auditioned for, and he never got the job, he never got the role. Then at some point he became really Stoic, Ryan Holiday says, the author. And what he did was like, I'm not going to depend on what they want, but I'm going to show like, okay, here I am the one you need to have. He came in full of confidence, and see now, he worked as a pizza deliverer back then, and now he's like this really famous actor nowadays. So you see Stoic principles work. Well, if you've listened to what I just said, this is pretty much everything Stoicism is not. You're striving for fame, for money, stuff like that. You know, I can see why he's doing that. Like, okay, we need to have some good example that people like. But yeah, you're not really doing what Stoics would say, like, is the right. You're not really. Is he a good person because of that? I don't know. Maybe he is, but it's definitely not because of that. Yes. We can talk about that later. Okay? Yeah. Because I am running out of time now, and I want to finish this one. Another really great example of the danger, and here we get to a bit of Broicism, is he took the example of Arthur Ashe. It was a tennis player, black tennis player, in the 70s, I think it was. And what Ryan Holiday says is like, you know, he's a really good example of someone who's stoic. You know, it wasn't good. Life wasn't good for blacks back then, but you know what? He just focused on what he needed to do, and he became successful anyway. He became one of the best tennis players, etc. Okay, and so I would say this is almost racist here. Because, you know, he's not acknowledging like, okay, maybe Arthur Ashe is really a talented tennis player, but there are tons of people who are not. Yeah, they can be stoic. Shouldn't he address the thing that is happening there in the US at that point? Right? Like, okay, yeah, it's good that Arthur Ashe, despite those circumstances, managed to be successful, but is that the thing you want to stress? Like, okay, black people could also be successful back then, almost implying like, okay, so if you were not successful, yeah, that's pretty much your own fault, right? You could have been stoic. Same thing for Hurricane Carter. It was a boxer. Bob Dylan also named a song after him, a song called Hurricane. A boxer who was wrongly accused of murdering someone, where actually 2 white people did it. And so he also said like he was very stoic about it, and that's why he came out better. Well, maybe he should have addressed something else there, not say like, okay, you know, wrongfully accused, you know, you can still be stoic, it's fine. You know, that's not really what it's about. He even has the example of Erwin Rommel in there. I don't know if people heard about him, but he was a general, military general, a Nazi military general. So yeah, that was, and he's saying like, yeah, he was actually not that into Nazism, but yeah, he was especially liked war, so, and he did that really well, so he's a really good stoic example, yeah. Then it gets a bit tricky, I guess. But that all comes from not knowing the context well enough, right? Not seeing that actually George Clooney, that Stoics actually thought like you need to be a good person. There's like one type of life, and not, you know, you can choose your own life as long as you're good at it. What modern Stoics say about it. All right, I'm going to skip over this. I want to end with this one. Seneca. He said this in his letters to Lucilius, or letters to a Stoic, as it is called in English. And he said, for us, for nowadays, if you want to be a Stoic, men who have made these discoveries, so natural discoveries, whatever discoveries, before us, are not our masters, they are our guides. So we don't have to follow them all of the time. Seneca is also saying we don't have to follow Seneca all the time. The truth lies open for all. It has not yet been monopolized. There is plenty of it left for future generations to discover. So also the Stoics said, please discuss what we have been saying. Please discover more. We don't know the truth. Seneca says all the time, this is what I can do with my knowledge. But don't quote me like I am a master. I'm a guide. You can see and match your thoughts with mine. Take me seriously, but form your own opinion. All right, that's what I wanted to say for now. Thank you very much.
That was the lecture. Interested in more? Check out our Instagram or website through SG Erasmus for our upcoming events, or as you did just now, listen or watch to one of our previous events on YouTube or Spotify.